"Your calculations are wrong," said the bodyguard to the billionaire. He laughed, but later went, "Look." Elliot Marlowe slid a sheet of numbers back and forth across the glossy expanse of his desk, the report catching the light of the floor-to-ceiling window in a cold shimmer. Outside, the city was a lattice of glass and motion. Inside, the air smelled faintly of espresso and certainty. He had built Marlowe Capital into an icon: investment funds, private equity, ventures that launched and then soared. People called him fearless. He called himself precise. Rosa Vale stood by the concierge desk like she always did, coat buttoned, posture straight, boots scuffed in a way that spoke of long nights and practical use, rather than neglect. For years, she had kept quiet about who she had been. The uniform and the clipped haircut were deliberate armor. When she walked into his office that morning, she carried the same quiet, unassuming attention she'd used to keep a watchful eye on his schedule, on the comings and goings, on small patterns that most people never saw. She didn't intend to interrupt. She had been tidying a stack of receipts on the hallway table when a line of figures on the deck of the report trembled under her gaze. Her finger traced a column that didn't add up, not by a rounding error, not by a glance. She saw the concentration in the subset of positions, the same counterparty showing up deeper into the portfolio with returns that were, politely put, too consistent. She cleared her throat. "Your calculations are wrong," she said, because the words were true, in truth had a way of surfacing. Elliot looked up and gave the laugh he used when he wanted a moment to kill a conversation. It was a sound that carried experience, an easy arrogance. "Rosa," he said, smiling, "I appreciate the keen eye, but this is finance. Numbers don't lie. These are audited figures." She didn't smile back. She didn't need to. She only lifted her chin, an unassuming signal. "Listen." He waved her away with a practiced hand, and the conversation ended as such things had ended 1,000 times in his life: dismissed, filed away, judged unremarkable. She returned to her post and watched him settle beneath the halo of the office lights, that particular constellation that had always told him he was invincible. If this story lands on you, tell me the city you're watching from in the comments. For a few weeks, the world behaved as it normally did. Press releases, conference calls, accolades. Elliot grinned for cameras and shook hands for charity galas. He rode the top of his market with the steadiness of a man who had never had to learn doubt. Team memos came and went. His chief financial officer, Tamir Sloan, presented slides that glowed with plausible optimism. The board admired the top-line numbers and applauded the growth that smoothed over nerve-tinged whispers. But portfolios have anatomy. They have bones and joints where pressure concentrates.
For Marlowe Capital, much of its heft had gathered around a handful of sophisticated, closely held positions. Private credit to a web of related companies. Hedges that were more faith than diversification. Concentrated exposure to a single major client account that had been the darling of the hedge groups for 2 years. On paper, the math looked attractive. In practice, it was brittle. Nobody at the firm wanted to see the brittleness. It is easier not to look. Pride consolidates into a strategy, vanity into a risk model. It began with a single client, Orion Logistics, a mid-sized shipping enterprise that had grown fast on the back of pandemic-era contracts and speculative capital. One of Marlowe's funds held a large private note tied to Orion. From the outside, Orion's revenue had looked dependable. Inside, the accounts were frayed. A supplier chain that seemed robust on the surface harbored a series of undisclosed related party transactions. When a regulatory probe in a neighboring country whipsawed Orion's main contract, Orion defaulted on a portion of its obligations. The default rippled. The private note marked to market produced a shock to the fund's liquidity. Counterparties, sensing a crack, tightened lines. Margin calls appeared like the first thin ice in a thawing pond. Then another client downgraded, then another. Ratings agencies pulled back. The market's disposition toward risk shifted in hours that felt like minutes. Elliot walked into the boardroom the morning after the first rating hit and found the atmosphere altered. Lamplight suddenly sharp, phones held like talismans. Tamir slid a fresh spreadsheet toward him with little apology and a thicker line of red where green used to be. The numbers told a story in blunt strokes. Liquidity shortfall, concentrated counterparty risk, a cascade of potential covenant breaches. The projected hit to the flagship fund would be in the mid-8 figures. That was tangible. Salaries, deferred investments, reputational capital. Lawsuits could follow. Clients would have to be informed. The tone in the room moved from stunned to defensive to aggressive. "You should have hedged that exposure," a director snapped. "You should have—" "We had a strategy," Tamir said, voice taut. The return profile justified concentrated positions. "But the profile wasn't stress-tested for this," another board member said. "We didn't run the scenario where a major client collapses and drags these funds with it." Elliot felt the air thicken around him. He realized, with a personal coldness, that this was no longer about spreadsheets that justified his decisions. It was about consequences. He had to act, and he had to act now. For several hours he paced like someone trying to outrun an accusation. The inner monologue that had been shrouded by success in other days now became a litany of missed chances and deferred humility. Then he thought of Rosa and the quiet certainty in her voice.
He thought of her finger on that column. He thought how lightly he'd dismissed her. Finding her should have been easy. She was always at the western entrance, near the staff elevator, where the day shift passed and the night shift arrived. But when he reached there, Rosa was not in uniform. She was in plain clothes, dark jeans, a practical jacket, the same alertness in her expression. She looked like someone who had stepped into a room to solve a problem. "Rosa," he said without preamble. He had the kind of insistence that used to open expensive doors. Now the door slid open as much because of habit as money. She did not rise to the theatrics. She listened while he presented a compressed version of the damage, the exposures, the likely investor reaction, the regulatory whispers, the legal risks. He told her how he had laughed when she warned him about the numbers, and how the laugh had lodged in him now like a physical thing. "I was wrong to laugh," he said simply. "I want your help." Rosa's face did not shift at his contrition. She had long ago learned to separate the person from the problem. "You'll have to listen," she said, "not pity me, not present me as a curiosity. You'll treat what I say as if it matters, because it might." That single condition mattered. It demanded respect. It asked for the dignity of her expertise, not a charity of attention. They sat at a small table in a back office, an island of muted light. Rosa unfolded a notebook, a ragged thing with annotations and an economy of ink that indicated a mind used to tracking details. She had been, years before, Rosa Vale Cordero, chief of risk at a prominent regional bank, someone who had designed hedges and stress tests. A scandal had unpicked a critical decision then, a series of over-optimistic assumptions, regulatory penalties, and a personal fall that left her reputation in tatters. That kind of fall does not erase competence. It deepens it, because there is nothing left to protect except the truth. She did not brandish a genius. She brandished experience and a capacity to see patterns, the kind the loud can't hear because their confidence is a blocker. She walked Elliot through the anatomy of what had gone wrong a second time, not as a denunciation, but as a precise map, where the exposures nested, what the correlated risks were, and how the accounting had smoothed over liquidity pressure by relying on optimistic counterparty behavior. "Concentration risk," she said, and Elliot bristled as if the phrase was a personal accusation. "That's when too much of your exposure lives in one place. Diversification is not a suggestion, it's a system. You put everything on a few winners, and then you pray when they wobble."
She recommended a short, realistic set of maneuvers: immediate transparency with the largest clients and limited partners, a quick external audit to validate the scope of exposure, negotiated liquidity support rather than unilateral market liquidation, and a prioritized rebalancing plan to diversify holdings gradually and minimize forced sales. She urged an independent forensic review of the private note structures connected to Orion. None of these were magic. None promised an instant turn. They were corrective. They required time, capital, and an appetite for reputational honesty. Elliot listened. He could feel the board's earlier skepticism echoing in him. Pride is elastic. It's both a cushion and a trap. He had to choose the less comfortable bend. He called an emergency board meeting that evening. He stood before his directors without notes and told them the truth, carefully but fully. He framed the problem, the potential losses, and the plan Rosa had sketched. The room moved through its predictable choreography: disbelief, accusation, finger-pointing, Then the slow calculus where avoidance shifted to action. There was resistance. Some argued for quiet buybacks and a selective disclosure meant to minimize panic. One director insisted on keeping full control of the narrative to protect the brand, which would mean delaying disclosure. Tamir argued for immediate liquidity maneuvers through credit lines that would keep the fund solvent in the short term. Others worried about the cost of transparency and the market's appetite for honesty. Rosa met the resistance calmly. "Hiding it will hurt more," she said. "You can manage a crisis. You can't manage a mass of regulators and investors who feel deceived. Transparency is costly. It's expensive in the short run. It's less costly than litigation and permanent reputational rot." There was a pivotal moment where Elliot could have folded to the safer immediate optics, hide a portion, declare a smaller hit, push the rest down the road. He felt the old reflex to protect the brand at all costs. But the reflex also ran up against a new sensation, the weight of responsibility for people who would lose jobs if the firm collapsed. He saw for a flicker of an instant faces: a portfolio manager with 2 young children, an analyst paying off student debt, a long-term client relying on a steady payout. He imagined headlines and the small human disasters hidden behind them. He chose the harder path. The company issued an honest statement to investors that same day, concisely outlining the issue and the plan to engage an independent auditor. It was an admission that carried immediate consequences, client withdrawals, and a spike in redemption requests. But it also carried an element rarely seen in corporate crises: ownership. They convened the external auditors and forensic accountants. Rosa insisted on a team with credibility and the authority to demand documents.
She spent nights at the firm, elbows on white tables, tracing lines of cash flows, following emails and calls, and sitting quietly while the auditors did work that takes time. The firm set up standby liquidity, agreements with sympathetic partner institutions that provided breathing room so long as the steps toward structural correction were followed. One of Rosa's first tactical moves was to negotiate temporary restructuring with the major lenders to the affected private note. If they could resist immediate forced liquidation, the portfolio could be rebalanced without fire sales that would lock in losses. Rosa knew the mechanics: renegotiate covenants, extend maturities where feasible, and create a staged plan for asset sales that prioritized stable assets for liquidity and held the more turbulent positions until markets cooled. Every choice cost something. The firm took a hit to its balance sheet. Some assets were sold at a loss. A small number of positions had to be written down entirely. There were layoffs, preventative and painful, targeted to reduce overhead while protecting the core team that would execute the turnaround. Elliot watched as numbers he had once accepted as abstract became names and faces, and that humanization shifted the tenor of his decisions. Board members who had initially pushed for secrecy moderated. Some left, some stayed. The media watched and parsed. Competitors could be cruel, but they also had to acknowledge when a rival chose candor over spin. The external audit, issued 3 months into the crisis, confirmed the basic contours Rosa had identified: improper concentration, weaknesses in counterparty disclosures, and some lax internal controls around execution. The auditors recommended specific remedial steps. The market adjusted. Slowly, the tide shifted. Investors who had enough confidence to wait saw the firm's straightened posture and its plan to diversify the portfolio reduce the probability of a catastrophic run. Some withdrew their funds, others stayed. New, more conservative partners came aboard, attracted by the transparency and the promise of stronger governance. Lawsuits were filed, as expected in such episodes, but the company's willingness to cooperate and to remediate the faults limited the settlements that followed. Throughout, Rosa refused to be portrayed as a martyr or a savior. She corrected narratives that would paint her as a singular genius. "This was a team effort once the company chose to lead transparently," she said. "My job was to make sure the decisions were the right ones, not to be the hero in a headline." Elliot insisted privately that he had been humbled. He found himself, weeks into the process, in rooms he had never frequented, town halls with employees, quiet conversations with people who had been hurt by the crisis, and a meeting with the families of employees affected by layoffs.
The billionaire's outer armor softened, not because of a PR strategy, but because he learned to listen, and, crucially, to accept that he had been wrong.
Part of the long-term response was structural. Marlowe Capital instituted new governance that enshrined checks on concentration and demanded independent reviews of high-return anomalies. It established strict rules for stress testing every meaningful position against downside scenarios. They created an external advisory board that included voices from outside the echo chamber, risk managers from other industries, a respected academic in systemic risk, and a former regulator. The changes were not gestures, they were policy. Perhaps equally important was the human response. Elliot offered Rosa a formal role that matched her expertise, a chief risk strategy officer position with authority to lead audits and to mediate between portfolio teams and compliance. For Rosa, accepting meant more than employment. It meant recognition. It meant restoring the dignity that had been stripped from her during the scandal years before. She had been cautious. She had avoided the predictable trap of accepting a token title. She negotiated terms and retained the right to maintain an independent relationship with a network of advocacy groups that worked on reintegration programs. The board and Elliot also agreed to launch a pilot reintegration program aimed at bringing back skilled professionals who had fallen from traditional career ladders, people like Rosa, who had knowledge, experience, and a desire to contribute, but who had been sidelined for reasons that ranged from scandal to systemic bias. The program offered structured roles, mentorship, and a policy of dignity that resisted tokenism. It committed resources not only to employment, but to support services and community partnerships. The gesture was not free of criticism. Some called it PR. Others argued it would be costly and slow to show results. But the program, modest in scale at first, enrolled 4 professionals in its inaugural year. 2 had technical backgrounds, and 2 had experienced public setbacks. They were given real responsibilities, not charity. The pilot's success was measured in concrete deliverables, strengthened compliance processes, more rigorous stress test scenarios, and a softer culture toward admitting mistakes. Cultural change in a firm is the hard work nobody sees. It requires people to take risk, not just in markets, but in relationships. Elliot found himself in a series of small, consequential moments, telling a junior analyst that it was okay to flag uncomfortable truths, allowing a counterparty review team to push back publicly, sitting with Rosa in a conference room while she spoke plainly to a board that had once scorned her. Those small acts accumulated into something less brittle than pride. Time did what it does. It blurred the edges of immediate panic and allowed a new strategy to emerge from the repairs.
The fund did not explode back to its prior valuation overnight. Losses were real and carried forward. Some investors had left for good, but the company's books straightened and its risk profile was demonstrably safer. New capital came in from partners who valued governance over glamour. The litigation resolved with settlements that, while costly, were manageable. The external audit endorsed much of the corrective strategy and closed its major recommendations within a year. For Elliot, the most visible change was interior. He kept a small note on his office shelf, the page from Rosa's spiral notebook where she'd first mapped the concentration. He looked at it whenever he had to make a decision that could be shaped by pride. The page became, in a symbolic sense, his compass. There were still scars. Some trusted friends had left. A handful of employees who had been deeply affected by the cuts took years to recover financially. But the company had not ceased to exist. It had, if anything, reshaped into a less brittle organism. In the months that followed, stories circulated about the bodyguard who had once been a CFO and returned to lead risk strategy at a top firm. The headlines simplified. The real story was grayer, more complex. Rosa continued to be careful about public exposure. She preferred to let work speak for her. She visited community programs. She mentored a handful of colleagues who had seen their careers derail for a host of reasons. Her life was not a fairy tale of restoration, but it was a steady season of regained purpose. There were moments of friction. Some board members resented the greater scrutiny and the new oversight. Some investors pushed back against more conservative return profiles. But the firm stuck to the new rules because the alternative had been failure. Practicality had become a virtue. One autumn, Elliot asked Rosa to join him at a quiet dinner. The city was settling into night. He wanted to return a small personal thanks that had no place in a press release. They spoke about things that mattered, about the thin line between confidence and hubris, about the cost of ignoring voices that do not fit one's narrative. He confessed that he had laughed the day she warned him. She said she had heard worse. They both laughed softly then, a small sound that was not empty. "You said my calculations were wrong," he said, looking at the streetlights. "You were right." "It's not about being right," she replied. "It's about making space for the corrective before it becomes a catastrophe." He left the dinner with a new sense of causality in his choices. The company hosted fewer celebratory launches for a while, but their work grew steadier and less performative. They prioritized resilience over spectacle. As the narrative matured, the reintegration program expanded beyond the pilot. It created an internal pathway that was not charity, but functional workforce development. Candidates were vetted on merit.
They received on-the-job placements, a mentorship structure, and a promise that dignity would not be transactional. The program's early alumni contributed to compliance teams, risk analytics, and even client relationship management. Their input was practical, attentive, and often blunt, exactly the sort of candor that the organization had previously mistaken for ingratitude. The company published a brief white paper about the changes, not as a self-congratulatory artifact, but as a resource for peer fronts. It outlined concrete steps: mandatory independent audits for concentrated positions, third-party reviews for high-return anomalies, and a transparent disclosure framework for investor communications in crisis scenarios. The paper emphasized governance and the moral case for second chances. Industry groups picked apart the recommendations, some embracing them, some criticizing them as insufficient, but the conversation had changed. In public statements, Elliot never exaggerated redemption as a story of sudden salvation. He spoke of months and trade-offs and real losses. He credited Rosa for her steadiness and for insisting on institutional accountability. He also credited the many people whose work had been necessary: compliance officers who dug into archives, mid-level managers who implemented day-to-day execution of the plan, and, crucially, the investors who chose patience. In private, Rosa took pains to reframe her own narrative. She avoided being hailed as a miracle worker. The times that mattered were the small, technical weeks of due diligence and the slow art of negotiating terms that bought time without inviting greater ruin. "Experience teaches you to assume the worst until the evidence tells you otherwise," she told a young analyst once. It's not pessimism, it's preparedness. The broader message that settled among those who watched was not about one person saving a company. It was about humility as a governance principle, and about the dignity of allowing people a second chance when they offer competence and accountability. The company did not become immune to risk. It became arguably better at recognizing it. A year after the crisis doorway had closed, Elliot walked past the concierge desk and paused where Rosa stood, tying a scarf. He remembered the laugh. It no longer sat in his throat as an accusation, but as a lesson. He had unwound a habit, the reflex to dismiss voices that did not conform to his expectations. They had changed policy, but more than that, they had changed posture. The firm instituted regular town halls where junior staff could ask senior executives hard questions. They created an ombuds system that encouraged internal reporting and protected whistleblowers. They added external reviewers to ensure the engines of decision-making were not insulated. On a quiet winter morning, at a small internal event, Elliot stood before employees and recapped the past day traveled.
He spoke not to correct the record, but to anchor the present in lessons learned. He closed with a line that had, in a way, started something vulnerable inside him. "Your calculations are wrong," he said, mimicking the voice that had once prompted his dismissal. And thank God someone had the courage to say it. Rosa, standing in the back, allowed herself a rare smile. She had not wanted that moment to be about her. It had become about the culture, the system that would now tilt, ever so slightly, toward humility. Months later, when he made a decision that would have been easy to justify with bravado and rhetorical flourish, Elliot found himself pausing. He thought of a column of numbers, of a woman whose boots had once been scuffed from scrambling to restore something broken, of a firm that had learned to convert pride into prudence. He kept Rosa's page on his shelf as a reminder. He no longer laughed the way he laughed before. He asked questions. He listened. And when someone else, months later, noticed a pattern in the numbers and said, "Your calculations are wrong," he did not smile the same way. He leaned in. The company never promised a miracle recovery. The losses remained part of the ledger. But time, honest work, and a structural change in how they treated expertise and failure gradually diminished the size of the wound. The firm learned to treat mornings as gifts, to revalue the competence of people who had been overlooked, and to understand that humility is not a weakness, it is a strategy. In the end, the smallest acts mattered: the note on a desk, a frank boardroom admission, a negotiated covenant that bought time, and a job offered without pity, but with respect.
those acts rebuilt more than balance sheets. They rebuilt trust. When the story circulated again in trade journals and case studies, the telling usually began with the line that had once been a punch to Elliot's pride: "Your calculations are wrong." It ended with the image of a billionaire who had finally learned to be corrected without defensiveness, and a company that had built, from a near catastrophe, a new architecture for integrity. Elliot never stopped being high-achieving. He stopped believing that achievement excused blindness. Rosa did not become a myth. She remained a steady professional who taught others how to see. Together, they created space for people like her to return to work with dignity and purpose. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs a reminder about humility and second chances. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe and come back for the next one.